Hello, welcome back to Movie Line Monday. This is Krishna, and the movie line today is from the Italian Job. I trust everyone, it's the devil inside them I don't trust. The topic I'm going to talk about today is APIs and the importance of APIs and the security aspects of APIs. So what is an API? If you look up the acronym, there are many different ways in which APIs are defined. It could be Advanced Performance Index, it could be Advanced Passenger Information, but the one we are going to talk about today is Application Programming Interface, which is what APIs that we are going to talk about today is all about. The history of APIs goes back to when computing languages were developed. APIs are pretty much a way in which large teams work together, where one team provided an API that another team consumed, and they go off and work separately, and when they integrate, as long as the APIs were defined correctly and the consumers used them correctly, everything worked fine. Now, APIs have evolved over time. With the advent of the e-commerce and the web technologies, APIs started gaining prominence, and it became even more prominent with social and mobile technologies. With a lot of mobile devices and social networking applications available, APIs have become an integral part of all applications today. Any application, be it consumer applications or even enterprise applications, depend on APIs. So there's a whole track of businesses that cater to developers by providing APIs to various types of services. Now, while that is good and it provides a rich user experience because you have all types of data that are integrated into applications, it has a lot of security risks associated with it. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of those risks. But before we get to the security aspects, let's do an anatomy of how an API works. When I talk about APIs, there are different types of APIs. So you might have heard of things like SOAP APIs, REST APIs or RESTful APIs, as well as there are very rudimentary form of APIs that are encoded in forms. Pretty much all traffic today that is relevance in the internet is all going over HTTP and most often encrypted over SSL. Now, these are typically the types of APIs that you would see. Now, when you look at APIs, there are two actors to this phenomenon. One is what I call the API consumers, and these are where the applications are running. So you have things like laptops, tablets, and mobile phones, right? And they could be in anywhere. The laptops or the mobile phones, they could be in campuses where people are doing their day-to-day work. They could be at home when people are working remotely, or even in a coffee shop where people are checking on things while they are sipping their favorite coffee. Now, so there are the consumers. Now, consumers are then trying to get data from service providers. So service providers are the ones that are providing the data to the consumers. So there are two types of data movement. Now, before we get there, the types of service providers, I've just given some examples here. You have examples like maps, like if you want to embellish your application by providing a map of where a user is or where some data is, you can go to a maps service provider using an API and get data and map it on the end device. Similarly, a lot of applications use analytics. They want to keep track of who is using the application, right? So that's another example of an API. Then there are places where you may want to store things, like you write a note and you want to store it. There are storage service providers where you can go and store data, right? Now, the service providers are not standing by themselves. Many service providers in turn have a partner ecosystem where they get more data to provide to the end user. The end user is not aware of the partner ecosystem, but indirectly the data that is provided to the consumer comes from other partners that are associated with the service providers. Okay? Now, those are the actors in this API play. Now, where does the data actually move? So you have cases where, let's say an application is requesting data from a maps application, right? Here, the data is actually flowing in the reverse direction. So this is where the data is coming. The information that was requested by the application is provided back from the service provider. But there are other applications like the storage case where data is flowing to the service provider. So you're moving, let's say, a file, right? This is now moving in this direction from the application towards the service provider, which may later on at some other point in time be accessed on the other direction, right? So the importance here is APIs are not one way, it's a two-way street. You could have service providers that consume data, and you can have service providers that provide data, right? So what are the security implications of this situation? Right. So let's take each one separately. Let's take the case where a service provider is providing data. Now, when data comes to the end device, you want to make sure that data is the intended data that you're looking for. If for some reason this data has been infiltrated and you have things like malware embedded, then they can take over the laptop, right? And you may be going to a reputable service provider, right? But because of the fact that the service provider in turn depends on a partner ecosystem, there is ways in which this partner could get infected, right, with some kind of a virus. And that could then infiltrate back to the end device, right? So that's one way in which bad data, even though you're going to a reputable system, bad data can come to the end system. Now, let's take the other case where you're pushing data to a storage service provider. In this case, this data, it's important as to what is in that file or what is that data itself. It could be sensitive data that is very important to your business. Could be intellectual property, could be PII or PCI type of information that puts your compliance at risk, right? So again, what data is going to the storage is something that is of importance and should be inspected, right? So if you look at enterprises and the way in which they are adopting applications that are in turn depending on APIs, it becomes very clear that you need some form of entity that is doing an API level inspection to determine that these devices are not being compromised, or your enterprise data is not being important enterprise data is not being sent over to the service provider and could be compromised, right? So it's very important that you have some form of inspection that does this at the API level. And once you do the API level inspection, you can identify the flow of data. Is the data flowing from the service provider to the client? In which case, you want to have a bunch of security services that is able to inspect the data for malware, for viruses, and any other type of infection that could infect the end system. Because once an end system can get infected, depending on the type of infection, it could then lead to some form of APT type of attacks that affect other systems that come onto the same network. So it's very important that some form of security protection is provided for the data that flows here, right? Similarly, for data that flows from the endpoints to the service provider, you want to be able to do inspection as to what the data file contains. Does this contain PII data? For example, run it through some form of DLP in this inspection security system, and if so, have the capability to block that file from going. Because as I said, if you do not know what is in this data, and if it indeed contains sensitive data like PII data, it puts your compliance at risk, right? So it's very important that that some form of API inspection and policy enforcement and security services be performed on applications that use APIs. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, APIs are everywhere. They're becoming ubiquitous. Every application in the enterprise is going to depend on APIs more and more. There's a whole economy depending on them. That's all for today's movie line. Until next time, thank you. Bye-bye.